The gate guard at FOB Greystone barely looked up. A government SUV, 2 passengers, civilian clothes, paperwork stamped with the seal of the Department of Homeland Security. The woman in the passenger seat was 55 years old, hair the color of winter ash, face unremarkable in the way that experienced people learn to make themselves unremarkable. The man beside her was 67, silver-haired, walking with a slight lean on a wooden cane when he stepped out. The guard processed their credentials in under 40 seconds. 2 policy analysts from Washington, here for 3 days, nothing to flag. He waved them through. Inside the wire, FOB Greystone hummed with the particular tension of a base that had been under pressure for 10 straight days. Situated deep in the Nevada mountain range, the installation was not the kind of base that appeared in recruitment posters or congressional budget hearings. It existed on paper in one department and in practice in another. Its official function was data archiving, Cold War intelligence records being systematically declassified and processed. Its real function was something older, something that predated the current generation of soldiers by 3 decades. Colonel Ray Decker had commanded Greystone for 2 years without incident. He was 52, lean and precise, a man who believed in clean lines of authority and clear threat assessments. What he had been living with for the past 10 days was neither clean nor clear. The group calling itself Black Meridian had struck 3 outer positions along the perimeter. Precision fire from distance. No American casualties, not one. The attackers had pulled back each time before any response could be organized, vanishing into the high terrain like smoke. Decker's analysts had mapped the attack angles. They had cross-referenced patrol schedules. They had run the numbers 3 different ways. The conclusion was always the same and always disturbing. Black Meridian knew the base. Not approximately, not from observation. They knew it the way someone knows a building they have walked through themselves. Every blind spot, every timing gap, every seam in the defense. And they had chosen, deliberately and precisely, not to kill anyone. That was the part that kept Decker awake. He met the 2 analysts at the entrance to the command building with the professional courtesy he extended to all Pentagon visitors and the private skepticism he reserved for those who arrived without rifles. Frank Alcott shook his hand with a dry, firm grip and introduced the woman beside him as Claire Weston, Senior Policy Analyst, DHS. Claire Weston nodded once. She did not smile. She did not offer the small verbal cushioning that people use to ease themselves into unfamiliar rooms. She simply looked at the perimeter wall, at the guard rotations, at the angle of the ridgeline to the northeast, and said nothing. Decker noted the way she looked at things. He filed it away without understanding it yet. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Decker walked them through the 3 attacks: dates, positions, weapons signatures, estimated shooter locations. He placed satellite imagery on the table and pointed to the high ground that dominated the western approach. He explained the wind patterns that made precision fire from those elevations exceptionally difficult. He described the response protocols his team had implemented after each strike. Alcott listened and took notes in a small leather book. Claire Weston stood slightly apart from the table, arms loose at her sides, eyes moving between the imagery and the terrain visible through the narrow window. She asked one question. After each attack, how long before Black Meridian was fully out of your engagement envelope? Decker looked at her. Approximately 4 minutes. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated. Decker waited for a follow-up. There was none. Sergeant Ben Taggart had been the primary sniper at FOB Greystone for 14 months. He was 29 years old, with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from being genuinely good at something difficult. His confirmed shots in this assignment ranged from 800 to just under 2,000 yards. He trained every morning on the Eastern Range, regardless of weather, because the wind in these mountains did not behave like wind anywhere else he had operated. It moved in layers. At ground level, it came from the west, steady and readable. At middle elevation, around 800 yards out, it shifted, running south to north with inconsistent gusts. Above that, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 yards, a third current moved in a direction that seemed to contradict both of the others. Taggart had spent months learning to read all three simultaneously. He was still learning. That morning, he was working a target at 1,900 yards. His spotter, specialist Garrett Lund, called wind readings from the Kestrel meter while Taggart made his calculations. First shot, 2 feet left. Adjustment. Second shot, high and right. Adjustment. Third shot, inside the target paper, but outside the scoring ring. Fourth shot, a near duplicate of the third. Taggart sat back from the scope and exhaled to his nose. Third layer is doing something different today, Lund said, studying his instrument. I'm getting a northeast push above 1,200 that doesn't match yesterday. Taggart was about to respond when he became aware that someone was standing behind him. He turned. The woman from Washington, Weston, was standing 6 feet back, hands clasped behind her, watching the distant target marker with an expression of mild interest. She had apparently walked out to the range without being announced and without anyone stopping her. The third layer, she said quietly, not to either of them specifically, is being compressed by the temperature differential coming off the granite face on the north slope. It's moving northeast at roughly 15 knots today. Yesterday it was probably 12. Lund looked at his kestrel, then at her, then back at his kestrel. Taggart kept his voice even. Thank you, ma'am. He turned back to his scope. She stayed. 5 minutes later, Decker arrived at the range with the particular stride of a man who had just been told something he did not appreciate. He looked at Claire Weston standing behind his sniper, and his expression communicated clearly what his words made diplomatic. Miss Weston, my people have work to do. She turned to look at him, not defensively, not apologetically, simply as a person who has been interrupted while thinking about something more important. He's been compensating for the first 2 wind layers correctly, she said, but the third one is pulling the round left and down in the final 400 yards. He's not seeing it because his instruments can't measure it from this position. Decker opened his mouth. She spoke before he could. Not aggressively, simply, let me try. The range went quiet. Lund stopped writing in his notebook. Taggart turned slowly from the scope and looked at her. Decker stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Alcott, who had appeared at the edge of the range without sound or announcement. Alcott made a small gesture with 2 fingers. Let her. Decker stepped back. Claire Weston sat down behind the rifle, the way a person sits down at a table where they have eaten 1,000 meals. No ceremony, no adjustment period. She settled her cheek against the stock, placed her left elbow exactly, wrapped her right hand around the grip with a pressure that was neither tight nor loose, but something in between that looked like the pressure of long memory. She spent 40 seconds doing nothing that anyone on the range could identify. She was reading the air, not with instruments, with the accumulated knowledge of a person who had spent decades understanding the relationship between wind and distance and the physics of a projectile moving through multiple atmospheric layers at the same time. She was calculating the aggregate, not 3 separate corrections, but one unified solution that accounted for all 3 currents as a single continuous problem. The rifle fired. 1 shot. 1,900 yards away, the target paper registered a hit. Center mass, not near center, center. Lund stared through his spotting scope for 3 full seconds before he said anything. Direct hit. Taggart did not move. He was looking at the woman behind his rifle with an expression that was not wounded pride, but something more complicated. The recognition of a gap between what he had believed was excellent and what he had just witnessed. Decker said nothing. His jaw was set in the way of a man who is reassessing everything he thought he understood about the last 40 minutes. 20 feet away, Frank Alcott took Decker by the arm and walked him a short distance from the others. What he said was brief. It was not loud enough for anyone on the range to hear, but the effect on Decker's face was visible from a distance. The particular stillness of a man receiving information that fundamentally rearranges what he thought he knew. Later, much later, Taggart would ask Alcott what he had said. Alcott's answer was precise. Her full name is Claire Weston. She entered Delta Force Special Reconnaissance at 23 years old. She served for 16 years. Her operational records were classified at a level that does not appear in any budget document available to the United States Senate. She has one confirmed engagement at 3,217 yards. Bosnia, March 1994. A shot that has never appeared in any official record because the mission it occurred during has never officially existed. He paused. Her birth name is Rachel Morrow. Her program designation was Chimera 4. Decker had stood very still after hearing this. He had looked back at the woman now rising from behind the rifle, handing it back to Taggart with a brief nod. "What is Chimera?" he had asked. "Something you do not have clearance for," Alcott had replied. "But something that has come back to find us." The drone report came in at 1400 hours. An object had been detected on the upper face of Shadow Ridge, the dominant high ground position to the northwest of FOB Greystone. It was small. It was camouflaged. It had been there, the imagery analysts estimated, for at least 4 days without being noticed. It was a high-frequency communication relay, compact, military-grade, installed by someone who understood both electronics and tactical positioning with equal fluency. The communications officer brought the technical breakdown to Decker's desk and placed it without comment beside a single number that had been circled in red marker by the analyst who ran the geometry. The distance from Shadow Ridge to the primary observation tower of FOB Greystone was 3,217 yards. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly, to the yard. Decker looked at that number for a long time. Then he picked up the report and walked to the room where Claire Weston had been quietly reviewing 10 days of attack data by herself. He placed the paper on the table in front of her. She looked at the circled number. She did not reach for the paper. She did not ask a clarifying question. She sat very still, and for the first time since arriving at FOB Greystone, the professional composure that had covered her face like a second skin showed something underneath. Not fear, not surprise, something older, something that had been waiting for a long time to surface. "We intercepted a signal from the device," Decker said. "Encrypted. Our people decoded it 12 minutes ago." He placed a second paper beside the first, a transcript, 8 words, Claire. "I heard Bosnia is still the record." "Prove it." The room was very quiet. Frank Alcott had followed Decker in. He stood in the doorway now, and if Claire had looked at him, she would have seen something on his face that she had never seen there before in 30 years of knowing him. Guilt. Not fresh guilt, old guilt. The kind that has been carried so long it has become structural, load-bearing, impossible to put down without the whole architecture collapsing. She did not look at him. She looked at the transcript. The handwriting, even in type form, even decoded, she recognized the cadence of it, the directness, the economy of words, the absolute absence of anything that was not essential. She had known one person in her life who communicated exactly that way. Owen Drake, Chimera 7. Killed in action, November 1994, during a classified operation at a facility in the Nevada desert. Body never recovered. Hatch sealed. File closed. For 30 years, Claire Weston had carried the specific weight of a grief that had no grave to visit, no record to confirm, no ceremony to give it shape. The kind of loss that the government creates when it classifies a person out of existence. When the answer to, "Where is he?" becomes that information does not exist. She had learned to live with that weight, the way people learn to live with injuries that never fully heal. She had built a life alongside it, rather than on top of it. She had served. She had trained others. She had come when called, as she had always come when called, because that was the only identity she had ever fully trusted. And now 8 words on a decoded transcript were telling her that the weight she had been carrying was not grief. It was something else entirely. She stood up. She looked at Decker. "I need access to the observation tower and Sergeant Taggart's rifle." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "3 shots. I'll take the device off that ridge." Decker studied her for a moment. A man calculating risk against something he did not yet fully understand. "And then?" he asked. Claire picked up the transcript, folded it once, placed it in her jacket pocket. "And then," she said, "we find out what comes next." The observation tower at FOB Greystone was 40 feet of steel and sandbag, exposed to the full force of the mountain wind from 3 directions. Taggart climbed up behind her, carrying the rifle and a spare magazine he had not been asked to bring. Lund came up last, notebook in hand. Neither of them spoke. Claire settled into position behind the scope and spent a long time looking at Shadow Ridge through the glass. Not at the device, at the air between here and there, at the heat shimmer off the granite, at the behavior of the sparse brush on the midslope, at the snow crystals drifting in a narrow band at approximately 1,200 yards, drifting northeast, as she had said, at 15 knots. The first shot came 2 feet low and 18 inches right of the device's antenna assembly. Not a miss by any conventional measurement. An adjustment point. Information gathered at the cost of 1 round. She worked the bolt without comment. The second shot took the primary antenna assembly off the relay casing in a spray of aluminum and carbon fiber. The device was damaged, still functional. Third shot. The optical module, smaller, better protected, disintegrated. The relay went dark. Taggart exhaled through his nose. Lund had stopped writing at some point during the sequence and had simply watched. The wind moved across the ridge in the pale afternoon light. Then the FOB's emergency broadcast system activated. Every speaker, every terminal, every radio receiver on the base simultaneously carrying a single voice. Calm. American. Male. Unhurried. "That's the same as Bosnia. Almost exactly. I've been keeping track." A pause. The wind over the tower, the distant mountains holding their silence. "I want to talk to you, Rachel. Just you. They won't understand what we need to say to each other. They don't have the history for it. I'll be waiting. You know I'm patient. I've had 30 years of practice." The broadcast ended. On the observation tower, Claire Weston stood with the rifle across her knees and looked out at Shadow Ridge, at the place where the device had been, at the terrain that surrounded it, at the high country that stretched away to the northwest, toward whatever was waiting out there in the cold and the distance. Behind her, Taggart did not speak. He understood, with the instinct of a soldier who has spent years reading situations, rather than just reacting to them, that something had just happened here that was older and deeper than anything on his threat assessment board. That the woman in front of him was not shaken by the broadcast. That she had, in some sense, been expecting it. That the real mission had just begun, and that he was standing at its edge without knowing the terrain. The command center felt smaller after the broadcast. Decker had pulled everyone in, his senior staff, his intelligence officer, Alcott, and Claire. Maps covered the central table. Drone feeds cycled on 3 separate screens. Outside, the perimeter guards had been doubled, and the quick reaction force was staged at the eastern vehicle bay, engines warm. Black Meridian had not moved. That was the detail that dominated everything else. 80-plus trained fighters in the high ground surrounding FOB Greystone, controlling every road and trail out of the valley, simply standing there, holding position, waiting, not attacking. Decker's intelligence officer had run the numbers twice. At current positioning, Black Meridian could coordinate a simultaneous assault on 4 sectors of the perimeter within 11 minutes of receiving a single order. The base could hold, probably, but it would be a hard hold, and the casualty count would be significant. They had chosen not to give that order. Decker stood at the head of the table with the particular stillness of a commander who is disciplining himself not to act until he understands what he is acting against. He was looking at Claire. She was looking at the terrain map. "He has us contained," Decker said. "Not defeated, contained. There's a difference, and I want to understand why he made that choice." Claire traced a finger along the ridge line on the map without touching the paper. "Because containment is the message. The attacks on your outer positions weren't designed to damage you. They were designed to demonstrate that he could damage you whenever he chose to. Everything since then has been about establishing that fact clearly enough that you would listen instead of strike." "Listen to what?" She looked up from the map. "That's what I need to find out." Decker's jaw tightened. "You're telling me a man commanding 80 armed fighters in a coordinated tactical operation around a United States military installation is primarily interested in having a conversation?" "Yes. That's not a threat profile I've seen before." "No," Claire said, "it isn't." She looked at Alcott. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the group, holding his cane with both hands in front of him. He had been quiet since the broadcast, unusually quiet, even for a man who measured his words with professional precision. He felt her looking at him. He did not look back. Decker wanted the airstrike authorization submitted within the hour. Claire and Alcott both objected, and the argument that followed was brief and pointed. Alcott framed it in terms of strategic risk. Claire framed it in terms that were simpler and more direct. "If you strike before we understand what he wants," she said, "you will spend the next 6 months trying to figure out why, and the answer will not make your career easier." Decker looked at her for a long moment. He pulled the authorization request back, but his expression made clear that this was a delay, not a withdrawal. He gave them 4 hours. Claire asked Alcott to walk with her. They found a room at the back of the administrative building, a storage space repurposed as an overflow office, a single window looking out at the base's western wall and the mountains beyond. Claire closed the door. She did not sit down. She stood at the window with her arms crossed and waited. Alcott set his cane against the wall. He lowered himself into a chair with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body has kept a long and expensive account of the years. He placed his hands flat on his knees. He looked at the floor. "The mission in November 1994, Claire said. "Tell me what it actually was." Alcott was quiet for several seconds. Outside, the wind moved along the base wall with a low, persistent sound. "You know the cover parameters," he said. "The facility in the Nevada desert, the prototype, the extraction team." "I know what I was told. Tell me what was true." Another silence, longer. "The facility was real," he said. "The prototype was real. A group of defense contractors operating outside their authorized scope had developed a biological agent, Project Harrow, and were preparing to sell the research package to a foreign buyer. The mission parameters given to the 4 of you were accurate in their essential facts. Locate the facility, neutralize the threat, extract." He stopped. Claire waited. "What you were not told," Alcott said, and his voice had changed, flattened, the way a voice flattens when it has decided to stop carrying a weight it was never designed to carry permanently, "was that the CIA wanted the research data before it was destroyed. Not to continue the program, to understand it completely, to develop countermeasures. The science was genuinely dangerous, and the analysts believed that destroying the facility without fully documenting what had been built there would leave a gap in our understanding that a future adversary could exploit. So you needed more time. We needed 4 hours, maybe 5. Time for our people to photograph, copy, catalog everything in that facility before the destruction charges went off." Claire turned from the window. She looked at him with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was something more precise than anger. The look of a person applying a key to a lock that has been closed for 30 years and feeling the tumblers finally move. You gave Owen revised orders the night before insertion. Alcott did not deny it. He was told to extend the timeline of the operation, to create delays, credible ones, the kind that would appear in the operational record as the natural friction of a complex mission rather than deliberate stalling. While Kemp and Allard went in under the original parameters, they were not told about the revision. Alcott's voice was very flat now. The decision was made at a level above mine, and it was made on the assessment that informing the full team created unnecessary risk of the revised objective becoming known. Kemp and Allard died in that facility, Frank. Yes. They died because the timeline was extended, because the charges were held 30 minutes past the original detonation window. Yes. The single word sat in the room like something with weight and mass. Claire walked to the opposite wall and stood with her back to him. Not to avoid looking at him, to give herself a moment in which she was not required to decide what to do with what she was feeling. 30 years. She had carried the weight of that mission as grief, as the particular grief of a survivor who comes home when others do not, who builds a life in the space that loss creates. She had never questioned the official account because the official account had been internally consistent, a mission that went wrong. Kemp and Allard killed by the secondary blast. Owen Drake unaccounted for, presumed dead in the facility collapse. Clean. Terrible, but clean. Now the account was something different. Now Kemp and Allard had not died in the natural friction of a complex mission. They had died in a manufactured friction, a deliberate extension, a choice made by men in offices who had calculated their lives into an acceptable column. He survived, she said, not a question. He extracted himself from the facility collapse over a period of approximately 6 days. His legs were severely damaged. He received assistance from a civilian in a remote area and spent approximately 18 months in recovery before he was mobile enough to travel. And when you found out he was alive? Alcott was quiet for a moment. I found out 14 months after the mission. A signals intercept, a communication pattern consistent with Chimera training protocols. I reported it to the program director at the time. What happened? The file was closed. The KIA designation was maintained. The assessment was that Drake had gone completely off-grid and that attempting to re-establish contact would create more risk than it resolved. Claire turned around. She looked at Frank Alcott, 67 years old, silver-haired, a man she had known for 30 years as the most precise and controlled intelligence architect she had ever encountered. And she saw what lived underneath all of that precision and control. It had always been there. She understood now why she had never been able to fully read him. Some things are not hidden because they are small. They are hidden because they are too large to look at directly. You chose to let him stay dead, she said. Alcott met her eyes for the first time since they had walked into this room. Yes, because bringing him back meant explaining why he had been given revised orders, why Kemp and Allard had not, why the timeline had been extended, why 2 men died in a facility that could have been cleared earlier. Yes, and no one above you was willing to carry that explanation into the light. No one above me, Alcott said, and including me. The wind moved against the building again. Somewhere outside, a vehicle engine turned over and held. Claire picked up her jacket from the back of the room's single empty chair. I'm going to go talk to him. Alcott straightened. Decker won't authorize. I'm not asking Decker, she put on the jacket. I'm telling you so that when I'm not back for breakfast, you know where I went. She paused at the door. If you had told me the truth in 1994, she said, I would have gone back for him. She left before he could respond. He sat in the empty room for a long time after she was gone, hands flat on his knees, looking at the floor where she had been standing. She went on foot, alone, a radio in her jacket pocket set to a frequency Decker did not know she had. The mountain terrain in the fading afternoon light was steep and uneven, loose shale giving way to hard granite, narrow game trails threading between rock formations that blocked the wind from one direction while channeling it from another. She moved without rushing, steady and economical. The walk of someone who has covered difficult ground in worse conditions, under worse circumstances, and learned that hurry is the enemy of arrival. It took 2 hours. The Black Meridian camp was positioned in a sheltered depression on the leeward side of a long ridge, invisible from the air at most angles, accessible by exactly 2 approaches, both of which could be covered by a single, well-placed observer. She identified the camp's outer ring from 400 yards and stopped. She stood in the open, both hands visible. She waited. A voice came from 8 feet behind her and slightly to the left. "You're slower on the uphill than you used to be." She did not startle. She had been expecting a voice from somewhere she had not identified. That was his way. It had always been his way. She turned around. Owen Drake was standing on a granite outcropping she had passed 3 minutes earlier. 58 years old, a face that the years had worked on seriously, deep lines, weathered skin, the particular density of a man who has spent decades outside and in difficulty. His beard was gray and close trimmed. He was dressed in civilian mountain clothing, functional and worn. He stood with his weight slightly favoring his right leg. The left one carried the old injury in its posture, not dramatically, just permanently. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not hostile, not warm. Something that had been through both of those states many times and come out the other side into something quieter and more complex. "You're slower on the uphill too," she said. He looked down at his left leg, then back up at her. Something moved briefly across his face that might, in another context, have been a smile. Fair point. They stood in the mountain silence for a moment. The wind moved between them. 30 years of unspoken things occupied the air the way weather occupies a valley. Present, inevitable, waiting to be named. "He told you," Drake said. It was not a question. "Just now, an hour ago." "Did it take long?" "No, I think he's been waiting to tell someone for quite a while. The wait gets inconvenient after a certain number of years." Drake nodded slowly. He stepped down from the outcropping and walked toward her, careful on the uneven ground, but not tentative. A man who has made a long accommodation with a limitation rather than being defined by it. He stopped 6 feet away. "I don't want what you think I want," he said. "Tell me what you want." He turned and began walking toward the camp. After a moment, she fell into step beside him, slightly behind, the way she had walked beside him on training exercises 30 years ago, when the terrain required single file, and they had defaulted to this formation without ever discussing it. The lab was the last thing she expected. A hardened tent structure reinforced against the mountain weather, powered by a compact generator running at low output. Inside, it looked nothing like a field command post. It looked like the workspace of a person who had been conducting systematic, methodical research for a very long time. One wall held computer equipment, 3 screens, external drives, communication hardware that was expensive and current. The opposite wall held something that took her a moment to process. Sample containment cases. Sealed, labeled with alphanumeric codes in handwriting she recognized as his. A portable analytical microscope, reference binders filled with documents in several languages, photographs pinned to a corkboard, facilities, vehicles, faces, transaction records, 25 years of work, right in front of her. She stood in the middle of it and understood. "You've been tracking Harrow," she said. "What was left of it?" He crossed to the corkboard and touched one photograph without taking it down. A storage facility in an unremarkable industrial setting. When the defense contractor group was disbanded in 1998, the physical samples from the Nevada facility were not fully accounted for. Some had already moved through informal channels. Some ended up in storage arrangements that were never properly documented. Over the following years, fragments of the research package appeared in acquisition networks that service buyers who are not asking questions about source. "Who has it now?" He pulled a chair from the desk and sat, not dramatically, with the efficiency of a man who manages his physical resources carefully because some of them are not fully renewable. A group of former CIA contractors. Their parent organization was dissolved in 2003, budget realignment after the restructuring that followed the invasion of Iraq. They were cut without adequate transition support and with enough classified knowledge to understand that they had been treated as expendable. Claire felt the word land, expendable. Drake continued without acknowledging it directly. They have been building a position in the biological weapons market for approximately 8 years. Their asset is not the agent itself. The samples they have acquired are partially degraded and would require significant laboratory development to weaponize. Their real asset is the antidote protocol, specifically the absence of it. They destroy the antidote, the weapon becomes viable without a countermeasure. FOB Greystone is the only installation in the continental United States that still holds the original antidote protocol from the 1994 research, a byproduct of the CIA's decision to document the facility before destroying it. It was archived here as part of the Cold War intelligence records declassification. Most people in the current chain of command don't know it exists, but they know. They have someone inside who told them. He paused. I have photographs. He reached across the desk and handed her a printed image. Taken from a drone, high angle, moderate resolution, enhanced in post. 2 figures at the base's outer fence line, west side, 0200 hours based on the timestamp. One of the figures was Specialist Garrett Lund. She looked at the photograph for 5 seconds. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. How long has he been providing information? At least 4 months, possibly longer. He confirmed the location of the antidote protocol server 6 weeks ago. The attack is planned within the next 48 hours. Claire moved to the tent entrance. She stopped without turning around. Why the perimeter operation? Why Black Meridian and the containment and the signals relay? Why not come directly to us? There was a pause behind her. When he spoke, his voice carried something she recognized as the specific texture of a truth that has been held for a very long time before being said aloud. Because I tried direct channels. In 2019, I had enough documentation to make the case credible. I sent it through 3 separate contact points to people who had enough clearance to act on it. Another pause. Nothing happened. The contacts went quiet. 2 of them retired within the year. One of them I haven't been able to locate since. She understood then the full shape of it. He had spent 25 years doing work that the organization which had trained him and then abandoned him should have been doing. He had tracked a threat that official channels had declined to acknowledge. And when he had tried to bring it in through the proper doors had not opened. So he had built pressure. He had created a situation that could not be ignored, that forced a direct engagement, that put the right person, her, in the right place at the right time with enough information to act. He had built Black Meridian not as a weapon, as a delivery mechanism for the truth. She turned back to him. Lund knows I came here. Almost certainly. Then he's already moving. She calculated quickly. If he alerts the group that Black Meridian's operation has been compromised, they accelerate the timeline. They go tonight instead of in 48 hours. Drake stood. Yes. She was already at the tent entrance. I need to get back. I know. She stopped one more time, looked at him across the small space, across the maps and the sample cases, and the 25 years of solitary work that lay between them, like a landscape neither of them had chosen. There was no adequate sentence for what this moment contained. She did not try to find one. I'll be back, she said, with authorization to work together. He looked at her steadily. I'll be here. She stepped out into the cold mountain air and began moving fast down the ridge toward the base. Behind her, the camp was quiet. The wind ran northeast along the high ground, and in the valley below, the lights of FOB Greystone burned in the gathering dark. And somewhere inside that perimeter, a man who had already betrayed everything was beginning to understand that his time was running out. She came back through the western perimeter at a pace that the guard on duty later described as unhurried but absolute. The walk of someone who has already made every decision that needs to be made and is now simply executing. Taggart was waiting at the inner gate. He had positioned himself there without being asked, without being ordered, operating on the instinct of a soldier who has identified the most likely point of return and placed himself at it. He fell into step beside her without speaking, matching her pace exactly. She handed him the photograph of Lund without breaking stride. He looked at it for 3 seconds. How long? 4 months minimum, possibly longer. Current location? Unknown. He had time to move after I left the base. Taggart was quiet for 2 steps. I know where he goes when he's off duty. There's a storage annex on the north side of the motor pool. He works on his truck there some evenings, keeps tools in a locker. Take Webb with you. 2-man approach, quiet. I need him contained, and I need his communications device before he can transmit anything further. Taggart peeled away without another word. Claire kept moving toward the command building. Decker was at his desk when she walked in. He looked up with the expression of a man who has been managing controlled anger for approximately 2 hours and is running low on the control part. You left the wire. Yes. Without authorization. Yes. I could. You could. She placed Drake's photograph on his desk, alongside 2 printed pages she had photographed with her phone inside the lab. The timeline of Project Harrow's dispersal through black market channels, and the technical summary of what the antidote protocol contained and why its destruction was the objective. But first, read these. Decker looked at the documents. He was a precise man, and precision requires patience, and he gave the documents the full attention they required. Claire stood and waited. She had learned decades ago that the most effective thing you can do while someone is processing critical information is absolutely nothing. He read everything twice. When he looked up, his face had changed. Not dramatically. The discipline was still there, but the structure beneath the discipline had shifted. The particular shift of a man who has been operating on one map and has just been handed a different one that explains why nothing on the first map made sense. The antidote protocol, he said. It's in the Cold War archive server, Building 7. Yes. And Lund has been providing access intelligence to the group planning to destroy it. Yes. Which means the containment operation outside our perimeter is not the threat. The threat is already inside. Black Meridian has been holding the perimeter to prevent the attack group from getting in, not to prevent us from getting out. Decker sat with that for a moment. Where is Drake now? In position in the high ground to the northwest. He has approximately 60 fighters who will hold the outer perimeter as long as he tells them to. He needs us to handle the interior. Decker looked at the photograph of Lund again. Then he reached for his radio. Get me Hargrove and the QRF. Building 7, Interior Defensive Posture, Authorization Code Delta 79er. Tell them it's not a drill and it's not external. He set the radio down. And get me a line to Washington. I'm going to need authorization for something that's going to make several people in several offices very uncomfortable. Claire moved toward the door. Washington is going to tell you to arrest Drake, she said. They're going to tell you to stand down the cooperation protocol and let their people handle the containment. I know. What are you going to do? Decker looked at her steadily. I'm going to tell them I received their instruction and that I am proceeding accordingly. He paused. And then I'm going to proceed accordingly. She understood the distinction. She had worked for men like this. Men who had learned through long experience that there are moments when the chain of command and the right course of action are not pointing in the same direction, and who had developed the moral clarity to know which one to follow. She left him to make his calls. Alcott was in the corridor outside the command room, positioned in the way of a man who is not sure whether he will be wanted or excluded from what comes next, and has chosen a location that allows for either. He looked at her when she came out. She stopped. There was a great deal she could have said. She had a full inventory of it, 30 years of it, the accumulated weight of Kemp and Allard, in a mission that had been built on a framework of acceptable loss that neither Kemp nor Allard had consented to. She had carried their names the way soldiers carry the names of the people they could not bring home. Now she knew the shape of why she had not brought them home. Drake found evidence of the attack group's interior contact 6 weeks ago, she said. He tried official channels in 2019. They went quiet on him. Alcott closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something was different. The last of the professional distance had come down. "I know," he said quietly. She waited. "One of the 3 contacts he used in 2019 came to me, informally, off the record, told me a former Chimera operative claiming to be Owen Drake had made contact with documentation on Harrow." He stopped. "I told him the claim was almost certainly fraudulent, that Drake was KIA, that the documentation should be treated as a potential disinformation operation." The corridor was very quiet. "You knew it was him," Claire said. "I didn't let myself know it was him. There is a difference, and it is a small and shameful one, but it is a real one." He looked at her directly. "I had spent 25 years with a closed file. Opening it meant explaining everything that had gone into closing it. I chose the file." She studied him for a long moment. The man who had shaped her career and her understanding of what service meant, who had also, over the same decades, been protecting a lie that had cost 2 men their lives and condemned a third to 25 years of solitary work in the cold. "There's going to be a moment tonight," she said, "where this either gets contained or it doesn't, where the Chimera file either comes into the light or goes back into the dark. Yes, when that moment comes, Frank, I need to know which way you're going to move." He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved against the building. Somewhere on the base, a vehicle engine turned over twice and caught. "Toward the light," he said. "I should have moved there 25 years ago. I understand that the value of doing it now is considerably less than it would have been then. I understand that understanding that doesn't constitute absolution." He straightened slightly. "But I am going to do it." She nodded once. "Stay close. When this is over, you're going to need to talk to people. Official people. Under oath." She walked past him toward the armory. Taggart found Lund in the storage annex at the north end of the motor pool, exactly where he had predicted. He was not working on his truck. He was crouched over a go bag, systematically removing its contents and replacing them with a different set. The particular repacking of a man who is preparing to leave quickly and does not intend to come back. On the workbench beside him, a compact, encrypted radio sat with its transmission light blinking in standby mode. Taggart came through the door with Webb 4 steps behind and to the right, and the approach was clean enough that Lund did not hear them until Taggart was close enough to place one hand on his shoulder. Lund moved fast, trained fast. He got one hand on the radio before Taggart's other hand came down on his wrist, with a grip that had the full mechanical advantage of leverage and intention behind it, and the radio went to the floor instead of to his ear. Webb secured the go bag and the encrypted radio as evidence, then took up position at the annex entrance while Taggart stayed with Lund. It was over in 4 seconds. Lund sat on the floor of the annex with his back against the truck's front tire, breathing hard, looking up at Taggart with an expression that had moved quickly through several stages. Surprise, calculation, the brief weighing of options, and arrived at a flat, closed stillness. "The transmission you were going to make," Taggart said, "to tell them their interior contact had been identified. That's what accelerates their timeline." Lund said nothing. "How many are coming in tonight?" "Nothing." Taggart crouched down to eye level. He was not a man who used volume or physical intimidation as primary tools. He had found over the years that a certain quality of directness, the kind that comes from having no doubt about what is true and no particular investment in performing that certainty was more effective than either. The antidote protocol. Building 7. We know that's the target. We know the entry vector they plan to use. What I need from you right now is the timeline and the number. He paused. You can tell me that, or you can sit here and be irrelevant while we handle it without you. Your choice, but make it quickly. Lund looked at the floor. Then in a voice that had the particular flatness of a man who has realized that the architecture of his choices has collapsed around him and is now simply dealing with the rubble. 14. Coming in through the utility conduit on the west side of Building 7. Access panel in the floor of the generator room. Another pause. They were coming at 0300, but if I don't transmit by 2130, they move to immediate. Taggart looked at his watch. It was 2047. He stood up and keyed his radio. The next 40 minutes moved with the compressed, purposeful momentum of a situation that has stopped waiting to be understood and has become a thing to be executed. Decker repositioned the QRF, 12 soldiers with full kit, into Building 7 through the main entrance, establishing a defensive line inside the server room and a secondary position in the generator room above the utility conduit. He pulled 2 of his best shooters to elevated positions outside the building, covering the western approach. He contacted Drake through the frequency Claire provided and coordinated the outer perimeter. Black Meridian holding their positions, preventing any secondary approach from the high ground while the interior action developed. Claire stood in the server room and looked at the antidote protocol archive. It was unremarkable in its physical form. A hardened server rack in a climate-controlled enclosure, indistinguishable from the dozens of other server racks in the room, except for the access log beside it, which showed that the last official retrieval request had been filed in 2009. 15 years of sitting here, holding the one piece of scientific knowledge that stood between a degraded biological agent and a viable weapon. Unknown to most of the people who walk past it daily, kept alive by the bureaucratic inertia of a declassification process that moved slowly enough that no one had yet looked at it closely enough to understand what it was. Drake had known it was here. He had spent years confirming it, and someone had told the wrong people. She checked her weapon, a standard issue M17 from the armory, nothing specialized, nothing she would have chosen for precision work, but entirely adequate for a building interior, and took a position near the server room's secondary entrance. Taggart was on her left, 15 feet away, covering the primary corridor. At 2112, the generator room floor panel moved. They came up fast, trained fast, 4 through the conduit in the first wave, moving with the coordination of people who have rehearsed this specific entry and know exactly where they are going. They neutralized the generator room guard with a taser, efficient, non-lethal, professional, and were through the generator room door and into the connecting corridor before the QRF's secondary position could fully react. The secondary position slowed them. Not stopped, slowed. 2 went down in the corridor, 2 pushed through into the server room anteroom. Claire heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of movement by people who are trained but are now operating under pressure, which introduces a quality of urgency that trained movement does not normally carry. The anteroom door opened. 2 men, tactical gear, moving to split left and right. She dropped the one on the left before he completed his split, center mass. The one on the right got 1 step further before Taggart's shot from the secondary angle took him down. 4 seconds. The corridor fight lasted longer. The remaining 10 attackers came through the conduit in a second wave, faster than the first, already knowing that the operation had been detected, shifting from precision entry to determined push. The QRF held the corridor in a grinding, close-range engagement that was not clean or elegant, but was thorough. Decker was in the generator room coordinating by radio, voice flat and precise, moving assets to cover developing gaps with the efficiency of a man who has done this in worse places with less. Claire moved through the server room to the archive enclosure and placed herself in front of it. Not because the tactical situation required it. The QRF had the corridor. Taggart had the anteroom. The perimeter was holding. She stood in front of it because it was the thing that 25 years of a man's solitary work had been protecting, and it seemed right that someone stand in front of it now that the moment had finally arrived. At 21:51, Decker's voice came over the radio. Corridor clear. Conduit sealed. Count is 14. 12 down, 2 in custody. A pause. Building 7 is secure. She found Drake's channel on her radio. Building 7 is secure. Antidote protocol intact. 14 attackers, 2 in custody. A pause on the other end. Not long. The pause of a man absorbing information he has spent 25 years working toward and is now allowing himself to receive. Casualties? He asked. 3 wounded, QRF, none critical. Lund? In custody, talking. Good. She was going to say something further, something about next steps, about authorization protocols, about the official framework that would have to be constructed around what had just occurred. All of that was true, and all of it was necessary, but what she said instead was, "It's done, Owen." The radio was quiet for a moment. For now, he said, not pessimistically, as a simple assessment from a man who has operated long enough to know that things are never entirely done, only move to their next phase. Come in, she said. There are people here who need to talk to you. Is Alcott one of them? Yes. A longer pause. The wind on his end was audible, the high country wind that she had walked through herself 2 hours ago. I'll come in at first light, he said. I want one more night up here. She understood that. She did not press it. First light, she confirmed. She lowered the radio. Taggart was standing nearby, having caught the end of the exchange. He had spent the last 4 hours fighting alongside a woman whose file officially did not exist, to protect a document that officially did not exist, on behalf of a man who had officially been dead for 30 years. He looked at her with an expression that was still calibrating what all of it meant. Is it always like this? He asked. She thought about that honestly, about Bosnia in March of 1994, about Nevada in November of the same year, about 16 years of Delta Force operations that had never appeared in any public record and never would, about the particular quality of a life lived in the space between what is known and what is done. No, she said, sometimes it's more complicated. The Washington call came at 01:30. Decker took it in his office with Claire and Alcott present. The voice on the other end was senior, carrying the particular authority of someone who has been awakened in the middle of the night and is managing their displeasure with professional efficiency. The instruction was what Claire had told Decker it would be. Detain Drake. Do not extend operational cooperation to an unauthorized armed element. Await the arrival of a federal team for site assessment and formal debrief. All materials recovered from the Black Meridian operation to be treated as classified evidence, pending review. Decker listened to all of it. Then he said, Understood. We'll be ready for the federal team when they arrive. He set the phone down and looked at Claire. First light, that's when Drake comes in. That's when this conversation becomes official and on the record. He paused. Whatever happens before first light, in terms of what documents get reviewed and what conversations get had, I will not be in a position to account for in detail. Claire looked at Alcott. He had been standing near the window through the entire call, looking out at the darkness, at the mountain terrain beyond the perimeter wire, at the high ground where Black Meridian was standing down for the night, at the country that had shaped and used and sometimes betrayed all of them. He turned from the window. I want to draft a statement, he said, before the federal team arrives. A full account of Project Chimera's operational history, Project Harrow's development and dispersal, and the decisions made in November 1994 that led to the deaths of Kemp and Allard and the abandonment of Owen Drake. He looked at Claire. I want it to be complete. I do not want it to be managed. I want it to say what happened. That will end your career, Decker said, not as a warning, as a statement of fact. My career ended in 1994, Alcott said. It just took me 30 years to file the paperwork. He sat down at Decker's secondary desk, asked for paper and a pen, not a computer, not a keyboard, a pen and paper in the old way, and began to write. Claire watched him for a moment, an old man sitting down in longhand in the middle of the night, the truth about things that had happened to people who deserved better. It was not enough. She knew that. It would not bring Kemp back. It would not return 25 years to Drake. But it was the thing that was possible now, in this room, at this hour. And sometimes what is possible is the only currency that remains. She left him to write and went to find somewhere to sleep before first light. Drake came in at 6:12. He walked through the eastern gate with two of his senior people and without weapons. Claire met him at the entrance to the command building. He looked different in the full morning light. Older, perhaps, the daylight unsparing about what the years had done. But lighter as well, in some way that was not physical. The way a person looks when they have been carrying something for so long that setting it down changes their posture without them being aware of it. They walked into the command building side by side. Decker met them in the briefing room with two members of his senior staff and a JAG officer patched in by video from a base in Colorado. The federal team from Washington was 4 hours out. The briefing was methodical and thorough. Drake presented his documentation, 25 years of organized, indexed, cross-referenced work that laid out the dispersal of Project Harrow's materials through black market channels with the kind of evidentiary precision that intelligence analysts spend careers learning to produce. The timeline, the acquisition networks, the identity of the contractors who had purchased the operational samples, the evidence trail pointing to Lund's recruitment and the planning of the attack on Building 7. It was, Claire thought, watching the JAG officer's expression as page after page came across the table, one of the most complete pieces of unilateral field intelligence she had ever seen assembled by a single operator. 25 years, alone, on a shattered leg in a burned file. When Drake finished, Decker sat with the documentation for a moment. Then he looked across the table. The federal team is going to want to debrief you extensively. There will be legal processes. Given your KIA designation and the circumstances of the last 30 years, your status is going to require formal resolution at a level above this installation. I understand, Drake said. The statement Mr. Alcott completed last night will be part of the official record. It names specific decisions and specific individuals. Some of those individuals are still in positions of authority. I know. You understand that the process that follows may be long and may not arrive at outcomes that satisfy every reasonable expectation of accountability. Drake looked at him steadily. Colonel, I spent 25 years on this because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected a particular outcome at the end of it. I'm not going to start expecting particular outcomes now. Decker studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, a small, precise nod that carried more respect than a longer gesture would have. The meeting continued. The revelation that broke the situation fully open came from an unexpected direction. In the systematic processing of the two attackers taken into custody, one of them, a man named Briggs, former CIA, contractor designation, redacted, made a statement before his attorney arrived that he subsequently recanted, but that was already on recording. In it, he named 4 people in the current intelligence apparatus who had been aware of the attack plan and had chosen not to act on it, not for sympathy with the objective, for reasons more banal and more depressing. The attack, if successful, would have destroyed documentation connecting those 4 individuals to the original Project Harrow authorization chain. They had known. They had calculated that the destruction of the antidote protocol, while regrettable, was preferable to the documentation surviving long enough to be read by the wrong people. Decker passed this information to Claire without comment. She sat with it in the same storage room where she had confronted Alcott the evening before. She sat with it long enough to let it settle into its correct shape. Not as a surprise, because nothing in the architecture of this situation was surprising anymore, but as the final piece of the picture that explained why Drake's 2019 outreach had gone quiet so quickly and completely. It had not been bureaucratic inertia. It had been active suppression. She went to find Alcott in the mess hall. He was drinking coffee with the particular stillness of a man who has slept 2 hours and does not expect to sleep much better for a while. She sat across from him and told him about Briggs's statement. He listened without expression. "The 4 names," he said when she finished. "I can guess 2 of them. So can I. They will have lawyers within the hour. The statement will be challenged. Yes. It may succeed. It may." She held his gaze. "My statement names the same authorization chain from 1994 forward. If Briggs's testimony and my statement are read together, the overlap creates a pattern that is harder to dismiss than either one alone. That was my assessment also." He looked up at her. "I need to make a phone call to someone on the Senate Intelligence Committee who has been asking questions about Cold War program accountability for 3 years and has not been getting answers. That call might be more productive made from outside this installation," she said, "before the federal team arrives and the information environment becomes more managed." He understood her meaning precisely. He picked up his coffee, finished it, set the cup down. "I'll need my phone." "It's in the evidence locker. I'll get it." She stood. He looked up at her, an old man at a mess hall table in the early morning light, carrying the weight of what he had done and what he was about to do, separated by 30 years and a quality of courage that had arrived very late, but had arrived nonetheless. "Claire," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry for all of it. I understand that the timing of that apology diminishes its value considerably." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Kemp and Allard. She thought about Drake on a shattered leg in a collapsed facility, dragging himself out over 6 days. She thought about 25 years of solitary work that should have been the work of an institution. She thought about what it costs people when those who should protect them choose instead to protect the system that employs them. "Make the call, Frank," she said. "That's worth more than the apology." She went to get his phone. The federal team arrived at 11:40. 4 agents, 2 attorneys, and a senior director from an oversight division created specifically to handle situations in which classified programs had generated accountability gaps significant enough to require formal investigation. Claire stood at a distance and watched the convoy arrive. She had spent enough years reading situations to know when formal machinery is moving toward justice and when it is moving toward the appearance of process. She could not tell yet. That was honest. But it was moving. In 30 years of working inside classified systems, she had learned that movement was the most you could reasonably ask for at the beginning of anything like this. The formal process lasted 3 days. Claire stayed for all of it. Not as a party, her own debriefs were completed in the first 6 hours, her statement on file. She stayed because it seemed important that someone who had been present from the beginning was present at the end. Alcott's Senate contact moved with the speed that serious oversight officials move when they have been handed material that closes gaps in a case they have been building for years. By the second day, 2 of the 4 names Briggs had provided were the subjects of formal inquiries. The other 2 had lawyers on the phone within hours of Alcott's statement entering the official record. The process was not clean. These processes never are. There were jurisdictional arguments and classification disputes, and the particular fog that descends whenever intelligence community accountability intersects with national security equities. But it was moving. On the 3rd day, the senior director came to find Claire in the small office she had been using. "His status," she said, closing the door, "the KIA designation. We're moving to have it formally amended. There are complications. 30 years of a closed file generates complications, but the path is clear. The pardon? Not technically a pardon because no charges were ever filed. More accurately, a formal acknowledgement, the record corrected to reflect that Owen Drake, Chimera 7, did not die in November 1994, was not a deserter, was not unauthorized, that he continued to operate in service of a genuine national security interest without institutional support for 25 years. She paused. There will be a document, signed, official. He'll want it to include Kemp and Allard. It will, Claire nodded. And Alcott? She asked. The senior director was quiet for a moment. He has cooperated completely. His statement is the most comprehensive voluntary disclosure of classified program misconduct I have seen in 20 years in this work. The people above him in 1994 are dead or incapacitated. The accountability that can be assigned to living individuals runs primarily through the four names in Briggs's statement. Another pause. Alcott will face a formal review. There will be consequences. But given his cooperation and his age and the nature of what he did to get here, those consequences will be measured. He knows that. He said as much. He said he wasn't expecting proportionate outcomes. He said he just wanted to tell the truth completely, once, before he died. The senior director's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. He's 67 years old, and he sat across from my lead attorney for 6 hours and answered every question without a lawyer present. That is not nothing. No, Claire said, it isn't. 6 months later, Arlington National Cemetery in October. The morning was cold and clear, the sky the particular hard blue of autumn in the mid-Atlantic, the kind of sky that makes everything beneath it look vivid and final. The trees along the cemetery's paths had turned, and the leaves came off in the wind in small, unhurried releases, the way things come apart when they are ready. The ceremony was small by design. No press, no public announcement, a private acknowledgement in the section of the cemetery reserved for those whose service had occurred in places that do not appear on official maps. A single marker, no rank, no unit designation, just the Chimera emblem, understated, precise, the emblem of a program that had taken 12 people and made them into something extraordinary, and then, in too many cases, treated them as variables in other people's calculations. Below the emblem, in plain letters, in service beyond recognition. And beneath that, 2 names, Kemp, Allard, and a third line corrected at last, Owen Drake, Chimera 7, honorably returned. Drake stood at the marker for a long time after the brief ceremony concluded, and the small group dispersed to give him space. He stood with his weight on his right leg, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, looking at the stone with the expression of a man who is completing something that has been open for 30 years. Not closing it. That was not the right word for what grief does. Completing it. Giving it the shape it was always supposed to have. Claire stood 20 feet behind him and did not move. She had spent the 6 months since FOB Greystone doing things that were, in their way, ordinary. Consulting work, a security assessment for a federal contractor, the slow beginning of conversations with Quantico about an instructor position that Taggart had been quietly advocating for on her behalf. She had slept better than she had slept in years. She had thought about Kemp and Allard more than she had in years. She understood that both of these things were connected. Taggart came to stand beside her, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the marker. I pulled the Bosnia record, he said, the unclassified fragments of it. 3,217 yards, March 1994. Single shot. He was quiet for a moment. I've been running the ballistics calculations, trying to understand how you account for 3 separate wind layers simultaneously as a single integrated problem, rather than 3 sequential corrections. Did you figure it out? On paper, he paused. I haven't tried it on the range yet. She looked at him sideways. You will. I'd like to try it with someone watching who's done it before, he said. It was not quite a question. It was the way serious people ask for the thing they actually need. Quantico starts their winter training cycle in January, she said. I've been told there may be an opening for a visiting instructor. Taggart was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll make sure the range is available. At the marker, Drake turned around. He walked back toward her at his measured pace, the left leg carrying its permanent accommodation with every step. He stopped beside her. They stood together looking at the stone. The leaves came off the nearby trees in small groups, carried in directions that were readable if you knew how to read them. 3 distinct currents in the air above Arlington. She could feel all of them. "What's next for you?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely, the consideration of a man who does not traffic in easy answers because he has spent too long learning what the easy answers cost. "Something quiet," he said, "for a while. I've been in motion for 25 years. I'd like to try the other thing." "You'll be terrible at it." "Almost certainly." The ghost of a smile, more present now than it had been in the mountain camp, finding its way back the way things do when the weight that was suppressing them finally lifts. "What about you?" She looked at the marker, at the 2 names and the 1 corrected designation, at the emblem of a program that had taken people and made them into weapons, and not always remembered that weapons are made of human beings. She thought about what it meant to have spent a life becoming genuinely exceptional at something and to arrive, at 55, at a moment where the skill and the purpose might finally, fully align. "I'm going to teach," she said. "Not tactics specifically, not marksmanship as a mechanical process. I'm going to teach people how to see what other people miss. The wind in layers. The thing that's happening at 1,200 yards that your instruments can't read from where you're standing." She paused. "The difference between what you're told is true and what you can actually verify is true." Drake was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like the most useful course anyone has ever offered," he said. The wind moved through the cemetery. The leaves fell in their unhurried way. Somewhere across the river, the city went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the small ceremony that had just concluded in this quiet corner of the most famous military cemetery in the country. Unaware of the names now properly recorded, the file now properly amended, the long reckoning now properly, if imperfectly, begun. Claire Weston, formerly Rachel Morrow, formerly Chimera 4, formerly the woman they had thought was just visiting, stood in the October morning and looked at the marker for the last time. She thought of the gate guard who had barely looked up 6 months ago, of Decker's jaw tightening when she'd asked to try, of Taggart's expression after that first shot landed center mass at 1,900 yards, of the 8 words on a decoded transcript that had cracked open 30 years of silence. She had spent a career being underestimated. She had spent a life proving the assessment wrong. And she had arrived here, at this marker, on this morning, with this wind moving through these trees in 3 distinct layers she could read without instruments, not because she had fought to be seen, but because she had never stopped doing the work. She turned away from the marker, not because it did not matter, because she had given it everything it was owed, and because what came next required facing forward. She began to walk. After a moment, Drake fell into step beside her. They walked out of the cemetery together, into the ordinary light of an ordinary October day, carrying nothing that did not belong to them. The gate opened. The city waited. And somewhere behind them, carved in stone in the cold and the quiet, 2 names and 1 corrected record held their place in the permanent account of things. Kemp, Allard, Drake, in service beyond recognition. At last.